the largest forum of happiness and well-being in the world. Visit us at www.worldhappiness.foundation. We are realizing a world with freedom, consciousness, and happiness for all.
Welcome to the Heroes of Reality podcast, a podcast about the game of life and the hero's journey we all experience. Let's jump in with our host, Dylan Watkins, as he introduces today's guest.
Welcome to another excellent day at the World Happiness Fest, and this topic is mental health. And today I have a very special guest. Albert Skiprizzo is a clinical psychologist and director of medical virtual reality at the University of Southern California Institute for Creative Technologies. He is also a research professor at USC Department Psychiatric at the UCS Davis School of Gerontology. His career has begun as a clinician providing rehabilitation services for those persons with traumatic brain injuries and stroke. Over the last 25 years, Skip has conducted research on design, development, and evaluations of virtual reality systems targeted on clinical assessments, treatments, and rehabilitations across the domains of psychology, cognitive and motor functions in both healthy and clinical populations. And his work is focused on PTSD, TBI, autism, ADHD, Alzheimer's disease, strokes, and other clinic conditions. And so without any delay, I'd like to welcome my friend, Dr. Albert Skip Rizzo.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, brother. It is always great to see you.
Good to see you too.
When I thinking about the whole mental health topic, really, I know, like, when I ever think of mental health and treatment and doing innovative things and really pioneering the way, and you are at the forefront of all that technologies. And so, I just really want to jam with you on the topic of mental health and what does it mean to be happy and what does it mean to, to really keep a healthy mind. Do you have any thoughts on that to kick things off?
Well, I'm not sure if it comes naturally. I think evolution has programmed us to always be hypervigilant about resources. And if we're not getting enough of those resources, you get anxious. And if you have failure over time, you might get depressed. I mean, maybe it's counter to evolution because getting depressed and not being happy is not a motivator for continuing to get resources. So, it's a complex, evolutionary process here. But in the modern age, I think the world has progressed faster than human evolution's capability to cope with it. 100, 200 years ago, I think things were tougher physically, but psychologically, there weren't so many periods of ambiguity or visibility of abstract threat. I think people were anxious about maybe different things in earlier times, but modern society puts a lot of stressors on people. So, I think it takes work to keep yourself happy. I don't know. I'm naturally a happy person, so it's not so much work for me, but when I see people, the field I'm in, when I see people that have mental health problems, I really look at stress and trauma as being at the root of it, and it diminishes their ability to cope and develops negative bias. Hence, they're not so happy. I don't know.
It's an
that
interesting
one question could go the whole hour.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, I mean, just looking at that, though, I mean, you're talking about naturally being happy, or like the fact of how happiness doesn't always serve us as humanity. Like in the past, like it doesn't really, like, trying to, like, if you're unhappy, and you're hyper aware and vigilant and you have anxiety, you're much more aware, which, those genes and maybe epigenetics are passing those things along. But there's also a thing around doing things that are maybe unhappy in the moment that give you happiness afterwards, those like hard tasks that then you reflect back on, versus that mild, chronic, low level. People use the word happiness, but it's really comfort, right? And then they look back and they're like, oh man, I'm not. It's kind of how I feel sometimes when I, like, back in the day, I'd sit around and watch TV all day long when I had a day off, and I just watch it all day because it's my time, haha. And at the very end, I felt all weird. I felt all like crutchy, and I'm like, wow, I gave myself a gift and now I just feel terrible. And can you talk to me a little bit about that, like the difficult things and being unhappy in the moment versus like comfort?
Some people have this theory about threat versus challenge, that the difference between those things are that With challenge, you estimate you have the resources to overcome an obstacle. And with threat, it's like you doubt you have those resources. So it's threatening. And so, like when you're playing a sport, against hard competition, if you're playing against a team that you think you got the resources, you go into it and you're more energetic. But if you think you're going to get butt kicked out there, you start to perceive it as threat. And that
Mm,
brings on a whole different set of things. So when people feel threatened by the world, it's oftentimes because they have a poor self-estimate of their capabilities to cope. So how do you get around that? Do you teach coping skills or socio-emotional learning, which
mm,
I think is an important element in modern society? But now I can't believe it. We're seeing political pushback in areas where this is being brought into a school system, kind of like how critical thinking skills were always criticized back in the 90s. I want my kid to learn how to read, write, and do arithmetic. What's this highfalutin critical thinking stuff?
yeah,
But back to the main point.
yeah,
We live in a world where there are things that maybe me and you or whoever would take on as a challenge. It's going to be hard work. You can see further off in the distance that if you overcome that challenge, it's going to equip you to accomplish your goals or get something you want later on. But if you have doubts and you feel ineffectual in taking on challenges, then everything is a threat. And it's hard to be happy in that context because you're always waiting for the next thing to come. I mean, we're talking about. I don't want to. We'll have plenty of time to flesh
mm,
this out because
yeah.
everything seems to be outside in focused.
Mhm.
But you can't differentiate those two things. There's ways from the inside that you can learn that even if you're not going to overcome a challenge, it's still not a threat. It can be a trial and error learning experience. So it's this dynamic interplay between what affords opportunity in a real world and what kind of work or what you have to face to get to it versus what do you think you got on the inside to get through it.
Yeah. What's interesting about that is you're talking about, okay, we all get stimuli. Things happen to us, right? We get affected, but what you're talking about is really what we choose, the meaning we apply to that story, right? Whatever the thing is, that we're talking about challenges versus threats, right? And that actually resonates a lot with me, is when I feel like I'm underqualified or something's going to happen and I have no, and I'm without hope. I'm hopeless. Then it becomes a threat, and then it becomes woe is me, and then it becomes that whole victim mindset and that thing that kind of comes in on top of that. And it's really hard because if you just tell someone, oh, just change what it means to you, right? Oh, just change what it means to you, and someone might sit there and just be like, oh yeah, well it means that doesn't mean that. It means that it's not a threat, it's a challenge, right? But saying those words is not the same thing as believing it, right? And how do you dig? How do you dig at that subconscious layer, right? How do you really, I mean, I logically understand threat versus challenge, but if I really am feeling like I'm overwhelmed, I might. How do I take my awareness and actually dig at that root to be able to change that out?
Well, there's a whole spectrum of approaches. The most commonly applied thing in therapeutic and in wellness context is, this whole cognitive behavioral approach, which, the underlying element here is that your feelings aren't directly tied to the event. It's what you tell yourself, how you interpret or appraise the event in the
Mhm.
world that dictates your feelings. And that a lot of times events in the world produce feelings that come about because people have gotten into habitual patterns of self-talk that is negative, whether it's overgeneralizing, like you make a mistake and you don't accomplish something. Instead of just saying, okay, I didn't do that, but I learned something, and next time I'll be able to do it. Instead, you're saying, oh, that's how it is with everything. I'm inept. I'm not capable. And so cognitive behavioral psychology tries to address what we call these automatic thoughts or these cognitive distortions, these unhealthy ways of interpreting your capacity to interact in the world in a negative way. And it becomes almost habit. Like we always say, the event happens and you say something in your mind and that drives the emotion. other people have different views about the, mind and body and emotion and what comes first. But, if you get into a habit where you're not even thinking those words, but it happens in a millisecond from this frame of reference that you have, that I'm not good enough, I'm always bad, I have no control. That's where you get this downward spiral into negative emotionality, I think, and being unhappy. It's all the whole cognitive behavioral thing is about your appraisal of the world and your capacity to deal with it. And you can make all these ties to different personality theorists from 100 years ago, Alfred Adler, the whole thing about competency in the world, or it's hard. It's really hard to tell somebody that's depressed or with a mental health condition, oh, just think differently about it. But if you can get them to engage over time and practice ways of being and ways of reframing their experience over time, it'll make a difference. Like, the whole positive psychology thing about, at the end of the day, you should write down 3 good things that happened that day. And if it was just a crap day, maybe you're writing down, well, I woke up, I continued to breathe, I ate something that sustained my life for a day,
Yeah.
At the very basic, the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy. But if you do that, and the research shows, if you do that for 30 days, all of a sudden you start to see a dramatic change in people's mood ratings about their life and about events in the world. And so maybe there is something by cueing people to look for positive things that is a counteragent to this response bias of negativity.
Yeah. So you're almost talking about like emotional fitness, right? The same way it's like, hey, you want to get strong? And you're like, go in the gym and lift weights. And somebody goes inside and they lift weights and they come back, I'm not any stronger. Actually, I'm more tired now. It's like, wow, you went one time to the gym. Good for you. Do that 30 more times, and then we'll talk at the end of the month. And so it's almost like the people look at the whole positive affirmations, or people look at, being aware of your mental state of the stories that you have. And if you do it once, it doesn't really do anything. Is that what you're talking about? Is that building that muscle over time? Is that an actual muscle? Do you know anything about that neuroscience behind that? I don't actually know if that actually is because I know my chest or my pecs, and I don't know if you could like scan the brain and be like, hey bro, look how strong my prefrontal cortex is, yo.
Well, we know anytime anybody learns something or engages in something to learn, there is morphological changes and functional changes in the brain. We just don't understand it fully, but I think your brain does change, just like a muscle with exercise. Totally different process. You're ripping muscles, and the muscle repairs itself and gets bigger and so on. But with the brain, you've got things that change in terms of when you're in highly stimulating, enriched environments, you get more axonal sprouting, which produces more connections throughout the brain. You see differences in the potentiation at the synapse that connect neurons. So you can get down into that muddy neuroscience stuff and say that, but I think it does speak to the issue that practice makes perfect. This is what I said in the very beginning. Sometimes it takes work to learn to be happy. And in some cases, you look at kids with adverse childhood experiences that follow them through their whole life because they struck a template early on that the world's a dangerous place, that I'm not good enough. Maybe they take responsibility for things that happened to them that they had no responsibility for. And if you can turn that around at an earlier age, then maybe you're going to save, 40, 50 human years of life of suffering, and be able to teach people to, find a beauty in the world, or find their place in the world, that they can accept themselves, or, accept you know, you don't have to be the most popular person in the room if you got one good friend, you know.
Yeah. And there's something to that. You're talking about like there's things that affect you when you're a child that you carry. You know, it's just this thing that you throw in like a backpack filled with pain, right? That in trauma, you just throw it on your backpack and it's just harder to get about and move those things. And there's like almost sometimes people feel this like this righteous justification, like I deserve this pain. I should be unhappy. There's like this there's almost like this like belief in some sort of ways that I don't know. I've seen that sometimes pop up with people where they don't really want to actually they feel like for some reason they don't deserve happiness or they don't deserve the ability to let go of the pain that they have because of some sort of like story that's anchoring them down. Like, and I'm curious about like when you when you see that with people, is there like a typical pattern to like healing that kind of trauma? Is there ways to actually break through that the resistance that some people might have to letting go of the pain that they're trying to like protect themselves with, right? Like I don't trust anybody. Everybody's a threat. At a young age, somebody threatened me, and so I can't trust anyone. And they just kind of go through their life moving that way. Is there like ways to help with that?
You know, I think that a lot of times the basis of like trauma focused therapy, the kind of things we do with PTSD, where we're encouraging people to confront and reprocess difficult emotional memories, to talk about it, to get it out. And that puts you on the playing field to be able to think about it in a different way. It's just so painful. People don't want to talk about that. Now, in this case, where it's like people look at it as a badge of honor,
Yeah.
you know, how much of that is, you kids don't know how easy you have it kind of thing, or how much of it is, feeling sorry for yourself, or how much of it is this endless cycle of a negative self-evaluation that was ingrained at an early age. That it comes down to a basic thing: helping people to tell their story, confronting elements of that story, and doing it repeatedly. Getting people to talk. A lot of times, people with PTSD, when you get them in a therapeutic context and they start to feel safe, and you get them to talk about the things that they experienced that were really bad, sometimes they've never talked to anyone about it. They never felt safe enough to be able to talk about it, or they always felt like they would be stigmatized if they talked about what had happened to them as a child, or what happened to them in a war zone or whatever. And sometimes just being able to have someone it sounds really pedestrian here, but just to have someone to get it out and to talk to in a non-judgmental way. And that's a part of the core of therapy. I mean, therapists always make judgments and try to help a person to overcome their challenges. But that's one thing a patient can feel is safety when they're in a clinical setting, unless they got a half-assed therapist. But the trip is with all this, when you look at what's responsible for clinical outcomes after therapy, regardless of the therapeutic approach, half of the variability is accounted for by the relationship with the therapist, what we call non-specific factors in therapy. Feeling an alliance, feeling you can trust someone, feeling that what you say stays in that room and that you're the focus of that therapeutic experience. That counts for at least half of the positive clinical outcomes, whether you're using behavior therapy or psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, humanistic therapy. And a lot of people don't like that because they get so invested in their orientation, their theoretical therapeutic orientation. Clinicians, they think, well, the science says behavioral therapy, observable behaviors, that's going to be the focus. These psychodynamic people talking about, early experiences with your mother or whatever,
So you're saying like I love the blanket statement of these unspecific terms of you're saying, really it's how getting out the trauma, because there's this thing that like you hold it in, right? And you have this event that happens that you don't share, either because of like shame or guilt or fear or whatever reason, but you don't feel safe to share it, right? And then if you create safety, psychological safety, and you have that bond with somebody, and you actually feel that there's things that I was looking at something that's like, building trust is a part of competence, right? Is like, are they competent in an area? And then also in terms of benevolence, like, do they have your back? Right. And I feel like when you're talking about these non-specific things, it's like, if I tell you, are you just going to go run and tell my mom? Are you going to go run and go to HR, whatever the thing might be, where you're like, are you getting this information to serve you or serve me? Right. And that is a really interesting thing of the healing that happens with that social connection of just being heard, and then feeling safe enough to where you have all this like armor where you're trying to protect yourself. And I don't know if PTSD is kind of like armor, where they're trying to armor up, and then you're trying to get them to open up because the wound is underneath the armor, right?
I think you put it in really great, perfect, intuitive terms. You know, one of the things with trauma is that people they got hurt so bad that they don't want to go anywhere that reminds them of the trauma, that is reminiscent of the trauma, or they don't want to think about it. They fight like heck not to think about it. They don't want to talk about it. And consequently, part of the therapy is to get people not to avoid, to confront these places, to confront these thoughts, to do it in a safe place, you know, and without the fear of shame. I mean, there's no psychologist is going to say, that happened to you. Oh, you better find a better, different psychologist. I don't want to see you anymore. You're never going to be abandoned. Good therapy anyway.
Yeah.
You have that acceptance so that you can talk about these things. You can confront and reprocess these memories. And a lot of times when people go through a traumatic event, there's alterations in their cognitive appraisal, and they walk away from it feeling either they were more responsible. You see this with sexual assault survivors. Sometimes they start to feel like, well, I egged this on, or I'm responsible in some way, or I should have known better. You know, you should yourself to death. And in actuality, that should never have happened to you. You had no part in that. That's not a right thing. And helping somebody to talk about it over and over and over. They don't do this. They don't have the opportunity to confront and think about it differently because they're so set on avoidance. And as you start to avoid things in life, you start to generalize more and more and more, and you're not so much fun to be around. So your social network starts to shrink a little bit. And so you're missing that social support in your everyday life, and you start to have a thin life. And this is why, you know, we always say it's hard medicine for a hard problem when we work with like our VR type of exposure therapy for trauma, because it is hard work. You know, but the pay, you know, we also counterbalance it by saying, you know, the suffering you're feeling shouldn't be a life sentence, that, you know, you can get past that.
Yeah. There's that thought of, it's my fault. It's my fault this happened. And that again goes back to the, I deserve this. I deserve to be in pain. I deserve this. It's my fault. And I want to suffer, or whatever the thing might be. Or there's something about that. I don't want to share it to anybody because it's embarrassing, or whatever the thing might be. But one thing you talk about removing the armor, and that's what I thought was really innovative about your Brave Mind project, and what you did with Brave Mind about this exposure therapy in VR and the work that you've done there. Can you talk to us a little bit about you know, what the Brave Mind application did, and kind of what was the effect it had on the population you were serving?
Sure. Well, I want to go back to a point you said about people say they deserve that.
Yeah.
You know, they deserve this. Where does that come from? Does that come from a dysfunctional upbringing? Does that come from a scorning, you know, parent? Does that come from, I mean, that sets the stage for a whole sequence of other kinds of mental health challenges that people may face if they go through life thinking they deserve to suffer. But where does that come from? You know, with trauma, you can point to a trauma, you know, and you can say your brain went haywire, flood of cortisol, you know, and your interpretation when you walked away might have been faulty, you know, because, you know, you weren't thinking right, if you will.
Well, let's look at this. We'll talk a traumatic event. I'm gonna do that. And the reason why I was actually thinking about the population from Brave Mind and some of the pains that come from that. But I'll give you just a more real example from my piece, and we'll
Sure.
hop into the brave mind section. It's like,
Yeah.
I'm an entrepreneur, and there's been times where I have completely wrecked a team, where I came in and I said the wrong things, and my ego was in front of it, and I said things I shouldn't have, and I blew up the team, and people left, and I had that trauma of wrecking a team's dynamics by me losing my cool, saying stupid stuff, right? And then all of that stuff coming out, and it's a traumatic event. But there was a piece of me that's like, there was like a story that I told myself that I've done a lot of work on, is that like, you're not a nice person. You can't handle your emotions. You're gonna freak out. You don't deserve to have a team, right? And holding on to a lot of that trauma that I caused, right, because of my inability to control my emotions, right? So I think part of that, and that was not the same thing as a population for Brave Mind, but in terms of a socially traumatic event where I felt shame and guilt, and I felt like I deserved to be punished because of this stuff, and it took a lot of forgiveness and apologizing and getting a lot of work to get through that process and actually gain a belief that I can resolve these situations. But that, for me, when you're talking about where does that come from, that's one thing that came to my mind of a situation that I caused it, and it was my fault, and it was a very powerful learning lesson. And I've actively worked on to try to get better at that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Well, yeah, and that's different than somebody who thinks this is how I am and I'm a bad person, as opposed to that was an event. I'm going to reflect on it. I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to try to do better the next time. I mean, I've had these experiences as well where, it's like, what the hell was I thinking?
Yeah.
Why did I do that? And you reflect on it. And, if you can walk away from it with hope that, well, that's one I'm not going to do again. I'm not going to make that mistake twice, because not only did it screw up the project, but it hurt. It hurts when you reflect on those things, and who wants to have those feelings, And so but it does come down to your willingness to face it, your willingness to, delve into the whys and wherefores, because everybody makes mistakes. Nobody's born fully formed. I'm getting at the later stages of my life now, and I'm thinking, boy, if I could start now with what I know, I would be less of an asshole.
Yeah, man. Yeah, but that learning lesson is like taking it as an event. I think my initial moment was, I am this way, like this was me, and it took a while to separate myself from that event, right? And it did take work on that, and there, it did come to a point where like situations like that happen in the future, or I guess more in the past, but when it happened again, right, and I saw myself start to spiral and start to piss off people, I actually stopped. I reflected. I, got one-on-one with somebody. We had a really deep heart-to-heart. I'm like, and I was able to recover that one situation with that one individual. I was like, oh, okay, it's not me against the world or me against my team that I'm fighting against.
Mm-hmm.
And then I turned that one around, and then I thought about it, and I kind of wrote out my feelings about like how I was feeling, just very emotional. And I went to everybody in front of them. I said, hey guys, this is where I'm at. Like, I don't feel good. I'm thinking everybody here is the enemy. I know you're not, but this is what's going on with me. I actually want to get closer with you all. And I had that moment, but once I solved it that one time, I then had that new belief structure that like, I will mess up, and it will happen, and it's okay. I can fix this.
Yep.
That is my new belief pattern now is I can fix this. And then if I fix it, I'm not in this world where I'm just like me against the world. Right. It's like, okay, I got to get vulnerable. I got to eat some crow and do some stuff.
And sometimes you just got to frankly apologize, and the act of apology makes other people feel better, but it also makes yourself feel better if it's genuine. There's a healing element to it, because it's facing the fact that we all goof up, we all make mistakes, and we're on this journey, constantly learning and hopefully refining, how we are in the world.
So that's the thing we were talking about, the ownership, and that's owning that event, taking it as an event, owning that story, coming out and apologizing to the people if that's the situation that caused it, and then making a commitment to move forward, right? And that's those pieces right there, at least, for me, created not switch that adversarial relationship into like, camaraderie, and that was a very helpful situation for me to kind of lean on. But not everybody
Mhm.
has that because you're trying to get
Right.
them to open up, and sometimes you talked about that non-judgment piece. I
You
was gonna
know,
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
wonder if this is part of the roots of some of the positive findings they're seeing with psychedelic therapy.
Huh.
From my experience with it, I'll just be honest here. I've had those kinds of experiences where all of a sudden defenses are down and you're seeing things very clearly, and all of a sudden you're not. I'm not. I wasn't liking so much of the things that I saw, and it was like, and then it snowballed. It's like, oh, there was the time I did that. No, there was this, and why did I do this and that, and but at the end of it, I could look at it and go, okay, now I have a clear appraisal of things I want to change, and I'm going to do it and move forward. And I think that that may be part of that. What people claim are the elements of the actual successes that have been reported in the scientific literature with psychedelic therapy for depression, for substance
Mm.
use disorder, for PTSD. Um,
It's
there.
interesting. Yeah, well, because I'm sure the biochemical piece of it going on. There's also the elements of what you're talking about of facing that dark shadow that you are afraid to look at, because it starts to stack over time, right? Or like another person gave a reference once. It's almost like holding balloons under the water, and you have all this stuff that you don't want to share with anybody. You're like, everything's fine, everything's fine. You just got a big smile, and you're like holding down the balloons and stuff. But when you're the psychedelics and you're actually doing the work, and I'm sure in those situations it's a very well facilitated and done with intention, but you face that shadow, right? You deal with it, you process it, and then you're right. You're like, oh, but also when you stare at it, I think a part of that also kind of leans back to it's almost like a psychedelic exposure therapy, if you would, right? I mean, it sounds like kind of what we're doing,
Mhm.
and a bit of
Yeah.
what you did with Brave Mind, in that thing where you look at it and you kind of like desensitize yourself to that situation. You're like, okay, that is true, but it's not something that I need to run screaming in the night from, you know?
Right, right. And that's part of what Brave Mind does for your audience.
Mm.
It's a set of virtual reality worlds that represent Afghanistan and Iraq context. Remote village or busy marketplace or industrial area, forward operating base in the mountains. And we have people that have come back from difficult combat deployments, and they have PTSD, and we tell them what we want to do, and they're like, I don't think I want to go back and revisit. And I go, look, it's hard medicine for a hard problem. It's going to get harder before it gets easier, but by going back and confronting this stuff and talking about it in a way that is honest and getting it out, and by doing this repeatedly, new things are going to come out. You're going to remember things in different ways. You're going to get a sounding board to reflect off of. And as you end up doing that more and more, you start to see the anxiety dissipate. And, it's not easy therapy, but it is helping. Again, our buzzwords are it helps patients to confront and reprocess difficult emotional memories while they're in a safe place with a supportive clinician. So, is it in VR? You can do it quite well because it's such an emotionally evocative technology. You ask people in a traditional format to close their eyes and imagine it. First off, you don't know what they're imagining.
Yeah.
They're telling their story, and sometimes it's a very constricted, cognitively sanitized story. Driving down a roadway in a Humvee and saw a guy up ahead with a cell phone, and IED blew up half our vehicle. My best friend died. End of story. Just the facts, ma'am, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But so the therapist has her work cut out for him, and because they want to pull out the emotions, and
Yeah.
say, all right, let's take it back 10 minutes down the road before you got to that point. Tell me about your best friend that you were with. And, leading up to that point, you get them to talk about some of these things. They haven't talked to anybody, but it starts to pull out these kinds of emotions. And as you do this repeatedly, a combination of brain conditioning, really, by repeated exposures, the activation in the fight, flight, or freeze area of the brain, the amygdala, starts to go down. You get a little bit more frontal lobe modulation of that back or middle part of the brain. But I think there's that cognitive personal sharing element that really is powerful, and you can't minimize the value of social support. You can have two people the same trauma, do the therapy. One person is living like an isolate without anybody around them, and the other person has rich family or friends or a sturdy husband or wife that's supporting them. That group is gonna ultimately do better. Social support is one of the key factors that regardless of therapy, and so that's a challenge when you're dealing, say, with a homeless person or somebody that doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of that. Part of your therapeutic strategy is not only what you do in a session, but to try to help them to find these things, whether it's a support group or find an interest that they had and try to pursue it with other people. It varies with everyone and what their competencies are and what their access to these things are.
That's
it's not
social
just
support.
one treatment. It's not just one thing that you're going to do. It's not like take a pill and bang. It's not like put on a VR headset and bang, you're fixed.
Yeah.
A lot of deep things here.
Well, what's interesting about that too, is you talk about that, is usually by running away from it, by taking that pill, by avoiding the situation to try to get into comfort, that thing gains momentum in the background. That whether it's PTSD or something not dealing with, whether it's being overweight or the conversation you're afraid to have, or insert the thing, but it starts to build momentum where you're like, there's this level of like, I want to be comfortable and I don't want to deal with it. And then it gets so big, it gets so massive, it gets so and stuff, it just eats up your world. And then it gets overwhelming, and then you get paralyzed without being able to do anything. Right. And
this is the endless cycle that perpetuates chronic PTSD. The idea that when you avoid something that makes you fearful or anxious, you get an immediate sense of relief. You're away from it. It's like, oh, but that, for behavioral theory, that relief reinforces subsequent avoidance, and so you get a whiff of anything that's reminiscent, and you're out the door. You start to have a discussion with somebody, start talking about something. You change the topic, and you never confront it to find out that it's not a threat any longer. It's a bad memory, and you're not going to erase that. As we tell people, you're still going to have all your memories. We're not taking those away, but you'll learn to be able to deal with those memories once you get past this avoidant activation that people have.
And would that be the definition then of, and I don't know if it is, it just kind of came to me, would that be the definition of happiness, is removing all of the trauma and all of the things that you're not dealing with and really tackling them? Like is happiness the absence of all the trauma that is compounding in your brain? Or what do you
coping? I think it's the coping with the trauma, because we all have our bad experiences, but how do we get over it? I mean, humans are actually quite resilient. I mean, you look at combat stats, and we freak out when 25% come back with a mental health problem, particularly with PTSD. But the other 75%, they felt bad. They saw some horrible things, but they adapted, they picked up, they moved forward, and over time, they kind of naturally had whatever coping mechanisms or brain processes, whatever your orientation is, that made them recover. They still have a bad memory, but it's not putting a harness on them as they go through life. That's what we're trying to understand. That 10 to 25%. Why is it that they don't let it go? It's no fault of their own. It's just what it is.
It hooks them. Well, it reminds me of, there was I know what back in the day was some of the old wars, right? There was a huge like opium problem where a lot of the soldiers did opium, right? And they had a big fear that they said, okay, well, we're gonna have you, I think it was Operation Golden something.
Triangle or something.
Yeah, but they would test the soldiers and they'd kind of clean them up and then send them into the US because there's a large amount of soldiers were doing opium. And they thought when they came back, they would all do opium. But odd thing was, they came back, it dropped back down to, it dropped back
Different
down to normal
context.
levels. Yeah, because you had that support. You're no longer in this threat survival situation where your life is on the line and you're trying to cope, right, by doing opium or whatever the things that they're doing. But it's a really interesting thing. You're talking about the social support and finding that new environment that actually allows you to adjust. So within happiness, then if you're unhappy, then to find that social support and that structure. Would that be like, what would be the steps if somebody was struggling, they wanted to be happy, right, and they didn't know how to get there? How would they start to cultivate that, and how would they start to build that over time? You talked about the gratitude being one, but what would be some other things that they could do?
Oh man, sometimes people, the opposite of social support is like clinginess, and people that think other people are going to solve their problem rather than participate with them on this journey and honestly feel empathy for them and care for them, have their back. But a lot of times there's subset of folks that somebody's nice to them and they just grab on, like kind of what you always talk about with borderline personality disorder and so on. So I don't know if there's a magic potion here other than getting engaged in activities with other people where there's maybe a common goal. I know there, for me, part of it was I played rugby for many years, and I could be depressed as hell, have a girl break up with me, and I was in the dumps. I'm on that rugby field, playing, and my focus is completely on that activity until I got off the field, that I'd be bummed out again. but that team, that shared activity,
yeah,
I think that's a big thing, and you can't think of one, then you join a support group and maybe that's helpful, and then you meet people there. I mean, I don't know. I think the world's different. I grew up in a different era. I couldn't just go online and have a bunch of social mediated relationships. I spend time in my room feeling sorry for myself,
No time on Tinder? You haven't spent any time there?
No, man. I was born too early for that.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because if you look at the social media friendships and stuff like that, it doesn't really feel as much friendship, right? You don't really get that as much. Although I will say that the social media virtual reality friends, I've had some really dope conversations in VR with people where I feel much more connected versus like this asynchronous. I send you a message, you send me I post, I wait for everybody to like it. Nobody likes it. I get sad. It's an interesting context. You're right though. But you're talking about that group activity that you lose yourself in, that you're all like on the mission and on the field. I do want to remind me later. I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine who's making this whole rugby league local thing that he's been like pioneering and pushing on. He's doing it over in Vegas, but I'll talk about it later. But I just want to. Yeah. Well, no, I think you guys would connect.
Your thing about avatar-based chat rooms and all that, where you take a the persona of a digital character and you interact with the other personas, so to speak, or avatars.
Yeah.
There's a guy at Duke. What's the one in Nashville? Big university there. Anyway, he's got a thing called Very Real Help, and he's got the Help Club, and it's peer-supported groups that gather in these VR idyllic worlds, and you're behind the shield of your avatar. Any self-consciousness you had is gone, maybe about your physical appearance, or if you're too tall, too fat, too little, whatever it is. And people really find this to be of value, and I don't think it's a replacement for good serious therapy if you need it, but it's definitely a gap that people can fill, and that they feel less kind of judged in some way. We find that with interaction with artificially intelligent virtual humans as well. People will reveal more. They'll self-disclose more personal information, reveal more incidents of sadness when they're talking to a piece of software in a human form than they will to a real person, or if they think it's an avatar of another person. So there's a lot of these things we've got to, look at as outlets or mechanisms for delivering this connection or making it available on demand, like Jeremy Bailenson book, Experience on Demand.
There's a couple of pieces there I think that are really interesting that I want to dive in with you on. That is, so you're talking about like people feel more comfortable when they're expressing their emotions to an AI or a bot of some kind because they don't feel judged, right? And at the same point, we know with neuroscience and with scanning the brain that people can form friendships. At least the same parts light up in the brain um, when they watch a whole bunch of TV shows and they start to like a certain character in a TV show, right? Like, so like the show Friends, I'm like, oh my God, or Joe Rogan, right? People think of Joe Rogan, everyone's like, oh, he's my friend. He's like, hey, Joe Rogan doesn't know you, right? He's a podcaster. He's putting out the content, but you spend so much time listening to this on-demand experience that you actually form an emotional connection to that. And I want to know, how close do you think we are to possibly having some sort of like therapist bot or some sort of thing that you can actually develop an emotional relationship where you'll know, like, and trust them like your favorite TV show person or podcaster, but you also know that they've got your back. They're not going anywhere. They're not going to report to anybody, and you have that, but you still have that connection with them. Have you seen anything on that, or have any thoughts around that?
Well, first off, I steer away from virtual therapists. I think there's a lot to be said for the idea of AI and in a therapeutic mode where it's always available, it's never judgmental, has encyclopedic knowledge of all clinical strategies, encyclopedic knowledge of everything you've ever said to it. So there's definitely things to be said for that kind of therapy, except it's missing that human to human connection, and AI hasn't evolved anywhere near formulating what a good clinical approach is for someone with complex problems. And it'll be the most contentious issue in the future, next 5 years of clinical psychology, any helping profession. A lot of care providers think, oh yeah, you can replace long distance truck drivers, factory workers with robots, all that, but not my job. But it will happen, and it will be very contentious. I tend to I'm old school. I want to stay in the middle. I would say maybe virtual companions that are reflective sounding boards and you can engage with. Maybe you get a therapeutic process out of the deal, and you have a place that you can talk to honestly, and there's something curative or healing or optimizing about that. But I don't want to call it a therapist. There's a lot of baggage in that. But a virtual companion, virtual buddy.
Okay. I got one for you then. There was this VR experience that they called Together VR, where you go on these like very PG-13 dates with this virtual girlfriend, and you play very typical relationship activities where you throw darts right against the board, right, and you try to compete with her, right, and then one day she comes home with a VR headset and she puts it on and she's an avatar and you put it on, then you play like a game with her, you do like rock paper scissors with her, you do all these like typical relationshipy activities, and like one of the last things you do is she's got her Sunday best on and she's lost a red envelope. You got to go around the house looking for it, right? Very like okay activities. And then she went to go leave, and when I was going through the experience, and when she came back, I actually felt like, and she went to go give me a hug, I felt my need to wrap my arms around and hug around. Like I was like, wow, there was like five little mini dates on here. I could imagine if there was like 1,000, if I would actually have this companion-ish relationship with this, definitely not a therapist, but a relationship with them. And it was just this little micro, it's just a taste of what I think is possible coming around the pipe. I couldn't imagine her trying to do therapy on me. I'd be
Yeah, right,
out.
right.
Yeah.
And you don't have haptic feedback, so
No,
there's no touch,
no,
I mean, what you're saying is like the next, 5 generations past falling in love with your pen pal. Back
Mhm.
when I was a kid, you'd have pen pals you'd write letters to.
Yeah. Yeah, man.
And when that letter would come in the mailbox, but your mom would say, "Hey, your letter came from that girl you met." You uh, but now you're doing it in real time, real action, real place, but no touch.
Yeah, but
Very
that's
interesting.
still social connection, though. Maybe it feels like social
Yeah,
connections, and maybe that's
yeah,
what you like. Is
yeah. I
how
think it's
how yeah.
I think it's possible. I mean,
Mm,
it's not impossible. It is. It
mm.
happens. People develop relationships with people they've never met in mediated format.
Yeah.
There's
What
no
do you?
question about that. I'm gonna have to go. I have
Mm.
a call at 4 with Nina.
Oh, yep. Cool. That
But
sounds.
we can
We,
close up with another
yeah.
question or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah. Well, yeah. We can wrap with this. My question would be this. Knowing that this is all around world happiness and being happy, right? And we talked a lot about on the trauma side and what does it take. What advice would you give in the areas of mental health and happiness? What things would you say to people to really help them shift the needle into a more happy state?
Man, I think realize that sometimes it takes a little bit of work, but the payoff is there,
Mm,
and that you know, follow your passion, as long as you're not, killing people in the process. Try to find something that you love to do, and do it no matter what other people say to you. You learn about yourself and you move forward. At the same time, you'll possibly meet people with like-minded interests. The combination of social support, but inner support that you get from following on something, finding something and learning about it and growing with it. Um, I mean, I think I would be a way less happy person if I hadn't found what I love in my work, and
mm,
that, has kept me going during tough times in other areas because I always knew I had that thing that I love to do and try to find it or join a group, go to a bird watching group or something, something you wouldn't normally do. And all of a sudden you start to find people, I think the challenge is when people aren't happy, they don't have the energy or they have the negative attitude that nothing I do is going to make a difference. That is
mm.
where you need possibly to get help so that you can get past that and start to engage in life. That's a downward spiral with
Yeah.
depression, um, where you don't put yourself in a position to get rewards, whether it's with people or it's with activities that are fulfilling or accomplishments that you may have. If you're out there, that's a
Yeah.
problem with depression. Is they call it psychomotor retardation. You don't want to do anything.
Yeah. So if you can't, so that's a great thing. Is like do anything. If you can't do anything, ask for help and have someone help you to do something, and then do it consistently so that you can kind of build that momentum up to get you to where you want to go.
And don't
Beautiful.
expect a overnight change.
Yeah.
Took a long time to get to the point where you're not happy. A lot of times it might take a little more work, and there's certain things in life that are not going to make you happy that you have no control over. Death or loss, you know an
Yeah.
occasional mistake that you made, but that's past. The future, you gotta put yourself out there. That sounds
Absolutely.
very maudlin and very pedestrian, but that I really
It
see
is.
that as part of the challenge. Once you get into that negative spiral, you don't put yourself in opportunities where you can get the reinforcement that will start to rebuild your life in a more positive way.
Yeah, it's an important thing, and it's the basic things that actually work, right? Happiness, friendship, laughter, connection, asking for help, building the things over time. I mean, all those things are super important. So, um, Skip, I know you've got to run, so thank you so much for your time. I very much appreciate you, brother. Have a blessed and beautiful day, my friend, and I'll see you on the other side.
You too, bro. It's been nice talking with you. Just
Absolutely,
like how we would talk normally over a beer.
We'll get one of those soon too, man. All right, dude. Much love. I'll talk to you.
See ya.
Peace, brother. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Heroes of Reality podcast. Check out heroesofreality.com for more episodes. While you're there, you can also take the Heroes quiz to find out what kind of hero you are. Or, if you have a great story and want to be on the podcast, tell us why your hero's journey will inspire others. Thank you for listening.